I am from Vytautas Magnus University down there in Kaunas. If you're watching on the live stream, hello. We miss you here. We wish you were here. I'm going to start off with a caveat, and well, I should also say, I speak English natively, and I'm talking about a subject that I am passionate about. So if I talk too fast, if I say things that you don't understand, if you're here, stop me, right? I'm a lecturer, as a professor, that's what I do, right? Raise your hand, stop me. If you're at home and you're watching and you have a question, go ahead and type it in and somebody will respond. But I wanted to start by saying the title of this lecture is a very nearly, almost entirely incomplete history of superhero comics. And the reason for that is we're dealing with about 82 years worth of superhero comic history. And I'm going to try to get that down into 45 minutes, which means by necessity I'm going to be missing a lot. I will tell you right now, while we'll do a glancing look at some of the other comic book companies in the early days, really we're going to be focusing on the two main ones, DC and Marvel, which when they started, right, DC was actually known as National, Marvel was known as Timely, but for our purposes we can still call them DC and Marvel. So we're going to be looking primarily at them, and we're probably primarily going to be looking at some of the main characters that you probably know from TV and movies. But the way that I'm going to approach it, I hope, is to look at it and give you a little bit of historical context, a little bit of historical references, and how kind of like, the Bible, right? A begat B begat C. And I'm kind of look at it in that way, that we start off with with the big superheroes and how they led down the line to what we have kind of today. So without further ado, let's see if this works. Aha! Good. Right, we get to the main question, which is, what is a superhero? I've got two definitions that I'm going to look at here. The first is by a guy named Stanley Martin Lieber, at least that was his original name. And we're going to talk about him quite a bit over the next 45 minutes or so. And I'll show you this example in a minute, but he changed his name to Stan Lee. We've all heard of Stan. But really, if anybody has an idea of what a superhero is, it's Stan. And so Stan says, a superhero is a person who does heroic deeds, has the ability to do them in a way that a normal person couldn't. So in order to be a superhero, you need a power that is more exceptional than any power a normal human being could possess, and you need to use that power to accomplish good deeds. Because if you didn't, a policeman or a fireman would be considered a superhero. Right? Now the argument always that comes up at this point is somebody we'll talk about in a few minutes, but the argument is always Batman. What about Batman? Batman's just a normal guy. Yeah, Batman's superpower really is that he's a multi-billionaire. He's got money. Right? He's also incredibly well trained and the smartest guy in the room, but that's his power. So now the other one that I want to take a look at too is a guy named Peter Coogan. Coogan is a comic book researcher, he's a comic theorist, and wrote a book called What is a Superhero? And I want to use I want to take a look at his thing, if I can maybe, there we go. A heroic character with a selfless, pro-social mission with superpowers, extraordinary abilities, advanced technology, or highly developed physical, mental, or mystical skills, who has a superhero identity embodied in a code name and iconic costume, we're going to get back to that, which typically express his biography, character, powers, or origin, transformation from ordinary person to superhero, and who is generally distinct, i.e., can be distinguished from characters of related genres, fantasy, science fiction, detective, etc., by a preponderance of generic conventions. Often superheroes have dual identities, the ordinary one of which is usually a closely guarded secret. Now, we're going to talk about that over the next 45 minutes, and how that plays into or out of what we're talking about. But we start we start where we all start, right? When it comes to superheroes, maybe. It starts here. It starts with Superman, 1938. Superman, created by two kids from Cleveland, Ohio, by the names of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. There's all sorts of stuff. I mean, we could do an entire 3-hour lecture just on Superman. There's been more written about him than probably any other character. But one of the interesting things that I find is, Siegel and Shuster are both Jewish. And so the origin story of Superman, that he leaves, he's leaving his planet, being sent away by his parents, his planet is about to be destroyed, mimics the Moses story very well. When he comes to Earth, discovers that he has these powers and these abilities. But also, Siegel and Shuster are both first generation American. And we're going to be talking a lot about America. The superhero itself with Superman is an American construct. Comic books are not. Comic books have been around, and we're not doing a history of comic books. We're just doing superheroes. And so the superhero itself really is an American construct. But these two kids, they met when they were in high school, they met when they were about 16, were both first generation Americans. Their parents came from Europe, Eastern Europe. Specifically, Siegel. Siegel is the guy who actually invented the concept. Shuster was the artist. Shuster was the guy that drew it up. But Siegel created the concept. There's all sorts of mythologized stories as to how this happened. They'd actually come up with an earlier character called the Superman, which was a bad guy. Looked more like Lex Luthor today, the bald head, the maniacal genius, wanted to take over the world. And then one night, Siegel couldn't sleep, had this idea, woke up, wrote down some notes, went back to bed, still couldn't sleep, woke up, wrote down some notes, went back to bed. The next day, woke up, ran over to Shuster's house. Shuster drew up the character that we now know of as Superman. But I said the first generation. Siegel's parents, his dad, right, Mikhail Segelovich, born and raised in Kaunas. So Superman's father is Litvak. They came over, right, they left Lithuania, they came over to America. Right? His father owned a shop. Now, there's also a lot to be made about the fact that his father in 1933 was shot and killed in a robbery at his store. Right? A couple of years later, his son creates a character that's bulletproof. Right? Psychological inventions of superheroes continues from this point forward. There's a lot of wish fulfillment going on. Right, but one of the things that makes Superman interesting, I'll put this down for a second. One of the things that makes Superman interesting is that nothing about him is unique individually. There's absolutely nothing new in the character of Superman if we take the individual parts. If we look at the tights and the cape, that's a circus strongman, right? If we look at the secret identity, that was done in it was Zorro, right? That had been done in the comic strips and the newspapers. But what Siegel and Shuster did is they flipped it all on their heads. We had aliens, right? We have aliens, we have humans going off into space. We have Buck Rogers, right? He's a human, falls asleep, wakes up 2,500 years in the future, and he goes off and he fights aliens. What we didn't have is the alien coming to Earth. That was new, right? Aliens existed, but they didn't come to Earth. The other thing that we have is that this right here, this image, that's the guy. That's the real person. That's Kal-El. That's the guy from Krypton. Clark Kent, who is the guy with the glasses and the suit, the news reporter, the human, that's the alter ego. And that also was something new and different that hadn't been done, right? We had the humans, the regular people, who took on the super alter egos, but we never had it really the other way around. Right? So Superman comes out, he starts at the cover of Action Comics, right? Action Comics #1, we get that very famous picture. I didn't put it up here because I figure everybody's seen it already, right? That picture of Superman with a car. It sold like gangbusters, did an amazing amount of business. As soon as it started, the publishers, a guy by the name of Harry Donenfeld published National, which became DC. He'd been publishing detective comics for a while at this point, but he wanted to start Action. Action started here with Superman. And he, trying to figure out the best way to say this, everybody wanted to get in on the action as soon as we saw that Superman was doing what Superman was doing. So Superman starts the ball rolling, absolutely. He is the first, he is the quintessential figure, right? But of course, he's immediately followed, because now everybody's trying to get in the game, he's immediately followed, well, here we go, here's Siegel and Schuster, sorry. Picture of Siegel and Schuster here, right? Siegel, Schuster, looking over their creation. But he's immediately followed by Batman. Batman shows up in 1939, he shows up Detective Comics #27 is where Batman first shows up. Now, there's some interesting, oh, sorry, new to this thing. By Bob Kane, Bill Finger, and Jerry Robinson. For a long time, until really about 2 or 3 years ago, right? So from 1939 until really about 80 years or so, the only name associated with Batman officially was Bob Kane. Now, one of the reasons for that is when Siegel and Schuster sold Superman to DC Comics, they sold him for $130. It was a 13-page story, $10 a page, and for that much money, DC Comics bought all rights going forward. Bob Kane was smarter. His dad was a lawyer. Bob Kane said, nope, not going to happen. I want my name attached to everything. And so he did. Now, just recently, Bill Finger got his name attached as well. Bill is responsible pretty much for the look of the Batman that we see here. Right, the cowl, the darker colors. The original concept by Kane was a kind of a red figure with bat wings and a domino mask, that kind of mask that just covers the eyes. But all the other stuff came from Bill Finger, and in fact, about 15 years after Bill Finger died, Bob Kane said, yep, I probably should have given him credit, but he never did. And we put in Jerry Robinson as well. Jerry Robinson didn't create Batman so much, but he was one of the primary figures involved in the early days of it. In fact, all three of them have incredible stories for creating the villain, the Joker. Right? All of them can lay claim to that creation, and nobody really knows. Records weren't really kept at that point. In fact, so much so that the only picture that I could find is Bob Kane. I couldn't even find a really good picture of Bill Finger. And Bob, for the latter part of his life, would go around drawing pictures of Batman and signing them and selling them for a lot of money. Right? Now, Batman is the antithesis of Superman. Right? Batman lives in Gotham City, also a Bill Finger creation. Right? Drives the Batmobile, Bill Finger creation. And he's the dark. Right? Now, he wasn't always. He's become much more dark as time has progressed. He wasn't always. Now Batman has the rule. He doesn't use a gun. He doesn't kill people. Again, not always. He would kill people when he first started. They were bad guys. It was okay. Right? So we've got Batman and we've got Superman. Now these two are with one other from DC, which we'll get to in a second. They continue publishing continuously. They have not stopped publishing since their introductions. There's always been a Batman or a Superman comic book coming out with regularity since the 30s. Right? Now, about this time, World War II starts. Right? Hitler invades Poland, starts rounding up the Jews. Now, a lot of the creators, a lot of the early creators of comics, I mentioned Siegel and Schuster, Jewish. Bob Kane, Bill Finger, Jerry Robinson, Jewish. A lot of them, a lot of these early guys were Jewish. Not because the Jews really wanted to get into comic books. That wasn't a thing. It was the fact that they were all writers and artists, and the advertising agencies wouldn't hire them. They're Jewish, right? Anybody watch Mad Men? You see the show Mad Men, right? Right. That's a couple of years later, but the same kind of thing. These guys aren't hiring Jews. Jews are not allowed. So comic books were kind of the ghetto, and these guys could find work there. If they could get out of it, they would. But really, this is what it was. Now, when World War II starts, America has an isolationist policy. They don't want to get involved. They're trying to stay neutral. It's not their thing. But over at Timely Comics is a guy named Martin Goodman. Martin is the publisher of Timely. But he publishes a lot of stuff. He publishes a lot of pulp magazines, a lot of girly magazines. He's got a publishing empire, really. But he sees what's happening over at DC, over at National Comics, wants to get in on that game. So he starts something called Marvel Comics, Marvel Mysteries, and he brings that in. And he's publishing comics. He hears what's going on over in Europe, right? A lot of the Jewish families that have come to New York, come to the East Coast, they're all sending letters back home to find out what's going on. Sometimes the letters come back and saying it's getting a little bit scary, and then they stop coming back altogether, right? We hear about what's going on. We hear about people being taken away. We hear about people getting shot. And so what Goodman does is he contacts two guys named Jaq Kirby and Joe Simon. Joe Simon specifically, and Simon brings in Kirby, and he says, we need a character to fight the Germans. There we go. Right? Now, he's not the first. Right here, Submariner Comics. This is part of Timely. Right? We've got the Submariner fighting Nazis. We've got these guys all fighting Nazis. Captain Flag over here, right? Is fighting Nazis. We've got Minuteman, the one-man army, Silver Streak, the Eagle. We've got all these guys coming in. Pep Comics, Prize Comics, Thrilling Comics. Here we go. Look at this. Captain Swastika. Right? Not this time, Hangman. You've met your master. Ooh. Right? It's all going on, but where does it all come from, really? Here's Weird Comics. We've got a nice slug here. Young Allies. We've got Bucky fighting the Red Skull here. Uncle Sam Comics. Right? Miss Fury. We have women. We have female superheroes kicking Nazi butt there. And we have the Shield. Now, I bring up the Shield last here because I said Goodman hires Joe Simon and Jack Kirby to come up with somebody specifically to fight the Nazis. We have these guys too. And who do they create? But Captain America. Now you notice that shield. I'm going to go back here. Notice this shield. And that shield. That's Captain America #1. Goodman is not known for his ingenuity. Right? One of Goodman's main tactics is, what is the other guy doing, and how can I copy it? Right? Now, that's not to say he's the one that said, copy the shield, but it's there. It took 2 issues before the shield became the circular shield that we now know. Right? Mostly because Pep Comics called up Goodman and said, you're copying my stuff, don't do that. Now, when it comes to copying, we have this guy, Captain Marvel. Right? Captain Marvel was sued by DC over Superman. They said, it's just a ripoff of Superman. At that time, Captain Marvel, Shazam, was actually outselling Superman. Right? Superman wasn't always the best seller. Captain Marvel was doing it, and of course, right, we have another Captain Nazi there. There we go. Right? And so this is the first time, though, that we actually get somebody slugging Hitler. That had never been done. And in fact, Goodman was a little bit afraid. He changed it in an earlier comic. He had Hitler in an earlier comic with the Human Torch or the Submariner. And he changed his name to Hissler because he was afraid that he was going to get sued. Afraid Hitler was going to sue him. And in this one, he was actually really nervous about putting this out because he was afraid that Hitler was going to be defeated and die before the comic could come out. Not so much. The interesting thing, one of the neat things about this, right, it says 1940. The cover date on this is actually March 1941, but the comic book itself was released December of 1940, a full year before America got into the Second World War, right? So Goodman absolutely was taking the fight to the Nazis, at least in the pages of his comics. That was certainly one of his things. And in fact, a lot of people will give him credit that if the comics were fighting the Nazis, it's because of Martin Goodman. The effect of Captain America was such that the American German Bund put out death threats on Simon and Kirby to the point that a guy named Fiorello LaGuardia, who was the mayor at the time, said, "We'll protect you," and actually sent police to escort Simon and Kirby to and from the offices because people were going to kill him over Captain America. Right? Now, I mentioned Stan Lee before. Where does Stan enter into all this, right? Because he really is somebody that most of us know if we've seen any of the movies, right? And we'll talk about his contributions in a few minutes. But where he comes from, where he started, I keep forgetting that I've got these pictures. There's Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. We're going to come back to Kirby in a minute. But there's Stan. Right? Here's young Stan Lee. It used to be that in order for a comic book to get the magazine rate for postage, it had to have text. There had to be some text. It couldn't just all be pictures. So all of the comics had to have some sort of a text story in them. Captain America #3, Captain America foils the traitor's revenge. This was the text story. This is the first thing that Stan wrote. Now, the name Stan Lee here becomes kind of, it's the fun story in that, I said his name was Stanley Martin Lieber. He shows up, he's 17 at this point, 1939. 1940, he was born in 1922, shows up because his cousin's wife, because they're going backwards, basically, Martin Goodman's wife's cousin's kid is Stan Lee. So he gets the job because he's related. He wants to be a writer. He shows up in the office, says, look, it's a distant relative, it's my cousin's kid, give him a job, no problem. They give him a job, does this eventually, but really, he's kind of the gopher. He just, gets things for Simon and Kirby, he erases the pencil lines on the comics before they go to print, he plays an ocarina and annoys the hell out of them. And yet, when Simon and Kirby leave, nobody else is there, and Goodman says, all right, Lee, go ahead. You're going to take over. You're going to become the new editor until I can find somebody. Never found somebody. But now the name Lee, of course, Stan Lee, where does that come from? Well, because Stanley Martin Lieber was going to be the great American novelist. He wanted to be a writer. He wanted to produce great works of literature. And since he was now working in the comics, he didn't want to waste Stanley Martin Lieber on a comic book. So he signed his first piece, Stan Lee. Right? Now, over at DC, we decide, let's form a club. We take all the heroes that we've got at the time, right? Here, this is the Atom, We've got the Sandman, the Spectre, the Flash, Hawkman, Dr. Fate, Green Lantern, and Our Man here. And they form the Justice Society of America. This is one way to get everybody involved, start getting their stories out there together. They come out in the winter of 1940, 1941. Ultimately, what we would get in All-Star Comics is these group things, as the characters like the Flash and Green Lantern, as they got more popular and got their own books, they would become emeritus members of the Justice Society, and more members would come in. We get Dr. Midnight in there. Eventually, we actually get Wonder Woman. We'll talk about Wonder Woman here in a second. We get Wonder Woman in there. Even though she does have her own magazine, Wonder Woman comes in, and she is the group's secretary. She's not even allowed to go off and fight because she's a woman. She's fighting in her own comic books, not in the Justice Society. Now here's Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman is a direct response to Superman. William Moulton Marston, fascinating individual. They just made a movie about him about 2-3 years ago called Professor Marston and the Wonder Women. There's a number of books written about him. He lived in a polyamorous relationship. He had one official wife, but one secondary wife. They had 5 kids between them. They all lived together. He's credited with creating the original prototype of the lie detector. He was a Harvard-trained psychologist. He wrote for TV and movies. Well, movies at the time, not so much TV, movies. And he, as a psychologist, he had written a number of articles about comic books, the funny books. And eventually he said, why isn't there a good, strong woman character like Superman? And so DC Comics said, sure, create it. So he creates Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman does go off to fight the Nazis, right? Her entire origin is involved with coming over from Paradise Island, which now, if you follow the mythology, now is called the Themyscira. And she does come over to fight the Nazis with Steve Trevor, who is basically her Lois Lane, right? Somebody that's always getting into trouble, and she's always having to rescue him. She is the other one of the 3, right? Between Wonder Woman, Batman, and Superman, all 3 of them have been in constant publication since their debuts in the 30s and 40s. Right? There's William Marston. I believe that's his wife, but I'm not positive. Right? So, World War II ends. With it ends the golden age of comics. Now, here's the thing, and kind of the way, I mean, what I've given you so far is a basic rundown of where things started. And it seems to me that the easiest way to kind of continue this is to talk about the ages of comics. These are generally agreed on by comics researchers and people that study comics. Up to a point, I'll show you where I diverge from some of the thoughts. But we can generally say the golden age ends with the end of World War II. Part of the reason for that is that superhero comics pretty much dry up. Right? Like I said, Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman keep going, but that's about it. Captain America, who in his heyday literally had 4 different comics that he was the headliner of, he goes away. He gets to the point where he's not even in his own comic. We actually get a couple of issues of Captain America's Weird Mysteries. And he disappears completely. What we end up with is all sorts of other types of comic books. And just briefly, right, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, who created Captain America, they go off, they invent the romance comic book together. We get a lot of westerns, we get true crime, we get all sorts of things. But it's not superheroes. Superheroes kind of disappear. All right, and these are the ages. We'll talk about them all, right? The Golden Age, the Atomic Age shows up, obviously, right, 1945. the atomic age kind of comes in with the atomic bomb, but something else happens there before we get to the silver age, which is this. This is so not used to working with this. Usually in my lectures, I just kind of wing it. Don't really make PowerPoint presentations. This is a guy named Frederick Wertham. Wertham was a psychologist, child psychologist. Wasn't even really a bad guy, he was just kind of misguided. And in his research, which has since been proven to be incredibly faulty, he determined that the bulk of reasons for juvenile delinquency is comic books. Right? Comic books are the reasons that kids go bad. Very specifically, things like Batman. Right? Batman has a kid sidekick named Robin. Now, one of the reasons that Bill Finger creates Robin, right? One of the reasons that we get Robin is because they were tired of having Batman talk to himself. Right? Batman would talk to himself, and it just kind of got weird and awkward. But at the same time, it gives the young reader somebody to identify with. Right? That's the general idea. And from that point, we also get things like where Captain America gets Bucky, who is his little guy. The Human Torch gets Toro. Right? Everybody has these little sidekicks, these little child sidekicks. Jack Kirby creates a group of kids that go off a street gang that fight the war on the home front. And for Wertham, part of the problem with Batman and Robin is that you've got Bruce Wayne, who is this millionaire living alone in a house with his butler. There's no women present. He takes on this young boy. Sometimes they sleep in the same bed. And so Wertham, in Seduction of the Innocent here, absolutely says that reading superhero comics causes homosexuality. Yes, exactly, right? It's, that faceplant. And he goes in front of Congress and says, this is the problem. Now, there's a guy named William Gaines who had taken over publishing a company called EC Comics, and again, out of the purview of this lecture. They did kind of horror comics. And his father was one of the ones that was involved at the very beginning of the industry. And when his father died, William took over, and William just didn't want to take guff from anybody. So when the congressional hearings were happening over this, William Gaines stepped forward and said, I'll take it on. Everybody else kind of backed away and said, we're not going to talk to Congress. Gaines said, I can do it. And it went down like a load of bricks. It was horrible. He hadn't had a lot of sleep the night before, and they were showing him pictures from his own comics with things like decapitated heads and all these horror things. And the question was, do you think this is appropriate? And his response was, for a horror comic, absolutely. Wrong answer. And so basically, Congress was going, yeah, this is bad. Even if they couldn't do anything about it, public sentiment really turned against the comic industry. There was all sorts of comic book burnings. And Wertham was hailed as this hero for bringing this attention to the parents of America. Before anybody could do anything, all the comic publishers got together and said, all right, let's stop this now. Kind of like they did in the movie several years earlier. And they created the Comic Code Authority. And the Comic Code Authority basically said, this is a list of things you can and cannot publish in your comic books. Right? Including things like no deviant sexual behavior, homosexuality. Right? This is when all of a sudden Batman gets a housekeeper who is a woman. Now they have a woman living with them, things are better. Right? And so the hero comics that dropped off were, there's things like you can't, no sex outside of marriage, there's a whole list of them. The bad guys always have to lose, right? Good guys can never lose, bad guys always lose. And all this stuff. And so everybody, and it's a self-selecting process. The Comic Code Authority is created by the comic publishers. There is no legal grounding to it. Kind of like movie ratings. There's no legal grounding there. It's just a guideline. But everybody falls in line with it. Everybody says, all right, we're gonna do this. We're all gonna follow this. Now this leads us to the Silver Age. Now, in the Silver Age, right, here's where the Silver Age comes in. Now, we get, all right, it's a time of science fiction as opposed to fantasy. We're gonna get to this in a minute. Yes?
I have a small question. Was a graphic novel an existing category at the time?
No.
Okay. That's all.
No. In fact, the term itself wasn't invented until, actually I was just reading about this, the term itself wasn't invented until the mid-60s.
Was there any category for adult comic stories? Because comic was like so just children's stories, anything?
They were all children's stories. Yeah, ish. Because like I said, in the 50s, right, you had a lot of true crime stories. You had photo books where they would have pictures of things. They would have with the EC horror comics that are absolutely adult. Which is one of the things that led to the Comic Code, is they were dealing with a lot of adult themes. But because of the subject matter, what happens, and this is a side note, we'll come back to this, but the older you get, the fewer pictures there are in your books, right? You start off when you're a little kid and you're reading picture books, and then they start adding a little bit of text. And then the text gets more and the pictures get smaller. And then eventually there's just like a picture at the beginning of the chapter and maybe one or two throughout the book. And then there's no pictures at all, and those are adult books. What happened and again, not part of this lecture, but what happened in 1986, 87, a guy by the name of Art Spiegelman wrote a book called Mouse, right? Which won the Pulitzer Prize. It was on the New York Times bestseller list, and the New York Times kept putting it on the children's list. And Spiegelman would call them up and say, it's not a children's book. And they go, but it's got funny animal pictures. It's like, yep, but it's not a children's book. It's about Nazis in World War II and concentration camps. And they finally, he said, finally, look, maybe we can create a category that's adult books with funny animal pictures. Can we do that? And they're like, all right, we'll just put it into the adult section, right? And you also had people like Will Eisner, who was doing The Spirit, again, not really a superhero, but dealing with much more adult themes. Eisner ended up leaving the comic industry and working for the government, and realized, and he's one of the people that's actually, even though he didn't come up with it, he's one of the people that's credited with coming up with the idea of the graphic novel. But he was using it as a teaching tool for the military, because he realized that soldiers work better with images, and that's the forerunner of building IKEA furniture. So there were adult situations, not with superheroes. Superheroes were pretty much the purview, at this point, of kids, right? And then once kids grew out of it, and kids up until mid-20s, Superman was the most sold book of any kind in military bases during World War II. So, so the fact that adults were reading it was there from the beginning, but really everybody, the outsiders, saw it as a kid's book entirely. Does that?
Yeah.
Oh, right. So when we get to the Silver Age, and we'll get into more adult stuff as we get into this. Right, it becomes a time of science fiction as opposed to fantasy. We have the atomic bomb has gone off in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Right, we're starting to get movies. We're starting to see the giant insect movies. Godzilla comes out in this time period. We get these people, right? Julius Schwartz, Mort Weisinger, Robert Kanigher, and Carmine Infantino, who are all over at DC. Right? Schwartz is the editor over there. Mort Weisinger is editing Superman. Carmine Infantino is also one of the editors. These guys are all doing the comic books over at DC. And over on the superhero side, right, Superman, Batman, we start to get families, right? This is where we get Supergirl. This is where we get Superboy. We get Crypto, the Superdog. Batman gets Batgirl and Batwoman, and and the Batdog and Batmite. You start to get Kryptonite, which was originally created for the radio show of Superman as a way to limit his abilities. Right, green Kryptonite causes weakness. I'm sorry. Come back to that. Right, green Kryptonite causes weakness. In the Silver Age, we start to get rainbow Kryptonite. Different colors that do different things. There's one Kryptonite that causes Superman to grow a beard. He was a hipster. There's one that causes him to lose his memory. One that causes him to get fat. They have different things. Seriously. I mean, these guys were just, they were all doing something and coming up with the weirdest stuff. Right? Friends, pets. Jimmy Olsen gets his own comic book at this point, right? Superman's friend, Jimmy Olsen. Lois Lane, Superman's girlfriend, she gets her own book. But Schwartz starts to realize that, you know what? Maybe it's time for superheroes to come back. How am I doing on time? Am I okay?
It's interesting enough.
All right, well, yeah, I gotta make sure I get back to the train by 9:10, so that's all. Right, so here, 1956, Schwartz brings in Robert Kanigher, Carmine Infantino, and says, let's bring back the Flash. But we're not going to bring back the same Flash that we had before. Instead, right, that Flash somehow had mystical, magical speed abilities. This is the science fiction age. So what we're going to do is we're going to make him a police forensics guy, and we're going to have him hit by lightning and a bunch of chemicals, and that's going to cause him to get super speed. And in fact, the reason he calls himself the Flash is because he's reading a Flash comic book from the Golden Age. And he says, oh, there's a nice character. Look, I have super speed now. I'm going to call myself the Flash. Which means that the comic book of the Flash exists in this world. That comes up later. Flash does well enough, right? It's in showcase number 4, right? Showcase is literally that. It's a comic book designed to showcase new characters. So they bring Flash, he does pretty well, they eventually give him his own book, they decide to try it again. What else can we do? Well, this time, October of 1959, we bring back the Green Lantern. But again, instead of the magical, mystical Green Lantern, this guy is actually a space cop. Right? He is chosen, it's a power ring, same as the old one, but now the power of the lantern comes from the mystical planet of Oa. Right? And the Green Lantern Corps are a group of intergalactic space cops. And they each patrol a certain sector of space. And there's, and the ring chooses them. And so he gets chosen by Abansur, who was the Green Lantern for this area. Abansur is shot down. The ring finds Hal Jordan. Hal Jordan now becomes the Green Lantern. And we get this resurgence coming in. Well, everything that's old is new again. Let's do it again. Let's bring back the group. Right? So now, in The Brave and the Bold, 1960, they decide to bring back all these characters, right? They still have Superman and Batman there. Now we've got the Flash and Green Lantern. There's Aquaman. We've got Wonder Woman. This is the Martian Manhunter here. And they decide to come back into now Justice Society. Not so much. Let's make it a league. That sounds fancy. That sounds scientific. Right? It's not just a group getting together. It's a league. So they create the Justice League of America. And again, it does gangbusters, right? DC has shown that comic book heroes, superheroes, can come back and do something in the marketplace. So now, we have an oft-told story that is probably not true, but here we are, 1960, 1961. As the story goes, Martin Goodman, remember him? Right? He was publishing whatever was coming along. He had one staff member over at Timely Comics. Stan Lee. Stan is still there. Stan is now 38, 39 years old. He has spent his entire professional life working in the comic industry, right? Whatever the new trend was, Goodman would say, Stan, create that. Stan would create 5 or 6 titles. Romance, fine, Stan would create it. Westerns, fine, Stan would create it. And that's what he did. Stan was pretty much the only one writing them. Goodman, as the story goes, and this, again, it's been debunked, but it's a good story. As the story goes, Goodman was playing golf with one of the publishers at DC, heard how well Justice League was doing, came back to Stan and said, hey, those guys over at DC, they got a group. They got a superhero group. Make me a superhero group. Okay. So, now, I've done an entire video on this next part. There comes a problem. At the same time, Stan was about to give up. He wanted to get out of the comics. Like I said, he'd been doing his entire adult life, 20 plus years. He was tired. He goes to his wife and he says, I can't do this anymore. I want to go off. I want to write my book. I want to be Stanley Martin Lieber again. And his wife says, look, what have you got to lose? He wants you to create a book about a group. Create the book you want to write. Do what you want to do. Stan said, okay. He grabbed Jaq Kirby. Remember Jaq? Jaq was the co-creator of Captain America. He grabs Jaq Kirby, who'd been working for him on and off over the last decade or two, and says, all right, Jaq, let's do this. And they created the Fantastic Four. Now, the Fantastic Four does, it changes the comics world completely. All right? First off, for the first 2 issues, they don't even have uniforms. There's no superhero costume. Right? We go back to our original definition. There's no superhero costume. Right? Then we add in the fact that they are literally a family. Right? You got Mr. Fantastic down here, Reed Richards. He's dating Sue Storm over here. This is Ben Grimm, that's his best friend. And Johnny Storm, well, that's Sue's little brother. Right? They're all a family. And they bicker like a family. Right? Part of the fun of the Fantastic Four is they are real. They have a certain amount of pathos. They don't get along. In fact, Ben Grimm spends most of his career, he's known as the Thing, and he spends most of his superhero career lamenting the fact that he's the Thing. All the rest of them can pass for human, not him. He can't. So, that's one thing. The other thing that happens here is Stan has them talking like real people, right? None of the staid and stoic superhero dialogue. They all talk like real people. Like I said, they argue and they fight and they bicker. And then eventually they come together to get the job done, but they're not happy about it. And whereas Superman lives in Metropolis and Batman lives in Gotham City and the Flash lives in Central City and Green Lantern lives in Coast City, the Fantastic Four, they live in Manhattan. They live in New York. Mostly because Stan was like, I can't be bothered trying to remember all these different cities. I live in New York, why can't they live in New York? It works. It works really, really well. Right? So then they decide, well, if it worked once, what else can we do? There's Stan. Right? What else can we do? So Stan immediately grabs Jaq Kirby. Right? Got the Fantastic Four, great. Now we can do the Hulk. We create the Hulk. Perfect. Right? Then he's got this idea for another character. He goes to Martin Goodman and he says, listen, Martin, I want to do a teen character. And Goodman says, like a sidekick? He's, no. I want the character, the main superhero character himself, to be a kid. Not only is he going to be a kid, but he's going to be a smartass. And Goodman says, it'll never work. Stan says, let me try. We're ending the comic anyways. It's a comic called Amazing Adult Fantasy. They've done 14 issues. But look, let me put him into Amazing Adult Fantasy, see what happens. Well, he tries it. He brings in Kirby to do it. The problem is Kirby draws very muscular very muscular figures. Stan doesn't want that muscular figure. So Stan brings in this guy, Steve Ditko, to do it. And between the three of them, these guys create pretty much the bulk of the 1960s Marvel milieu, right? Of course, the character that I was talking about there's the Hulk. That's the one that Steve Ditko came in to draw, Spider-Man, who very quickly became the most popular character in the Marvel Universe, right? Then we had Thor, right? Stan brings in Thor, brings in his brother, Larry Lieber, to write that, right? Again, right? Nepotism is great. Stan got the job because he knew somebody, so he brings in Larry. Iron Man comes in because somebody said to Stan, can you give me a character that's kind of a dick? And make him a hero. And Stan said, all right, right? Now, again, this is the middle of the 60s. We've got the Vietnam War happening. Stan says, all right, what's the most absurd character I can come up with to make him a hero? I know, I'm going to make him a weapons manufacturer. I'm going to make him a member of the military-industrial complex and make him a hero. Right? So he comes up with Iron Man. Everything's going great. He and Jaq then create the X-Men, right? The X-Men become the de facto stand-in for pretty much any other group that we had, right? As we're moving into the 60s, here we're going to get a lot of groups that are other, right? They're mutants. We can use them to represent homosexuals. We can use them to represent foreigners. We can use them to represent minorities. Anything you want. The X-Men, you know, somebody has written a paper someplace that the X-Men fills that gap. And then, just to bring back the cosmic, we have the Silver Surfer. Right? These are all, I didn't bring in Doctor Strange, sorry. Doctor Strange is another Ditko creation, but all the rest of these are pretty much Kirby and Kirby and Lee. Right? These guys are like the Lennon and McCartney, if you guys know Lennon and McCartney. Yeah, okay, I got like one person who guessed. Right? They're like the Lennon and McCartney of comic books. Right? Now, what happens here is that Stan becomes the face of comics. Right? With the Silver Surfer, with Doctor Strange, you asked about adults. College students start reading these more than kids. Stan starts touring college campuses and becomes the face of comic books. He becomes the guy that everybody looks at and says, ah, this is comics. Now, he does something really interesting at the time. Right? From the beginning, all the characters that had their own fan clubs, you send in a dime, you got a little membership card, right? Captain America had the Sentinels of Liberty. Stan says, screw that. Why should you become a fan of any particular character? Because all of my characters, well, they all live in New York City. They all know each other, right? Spider-Man #1, he auditions to become a member of the Fantastic Four because he needs money. He needs a job. When they tell him that it doesn't pay, he leaves, right? So Stan's like, why should you become a fan of any particular comic? Why don't you become a fan of the company? And he creates the Merry Marvel Marching Society, right? Which is a fan club for Marvel Comics. Send in your $1, you get your membership kit. 50,000 of them went out, right? Everybody wanted to be a member of the Marvel Marching Society, right? By the time we get to 66, though, things start to get a little bit weird. You get Batman showing up, right? The comics at this point are still mainstream, but are still, you know, the universities are still not exactly the mainstream. Batman hits 1966. Again, huge hit, and takes the comics mainstream. This is where we get POWs and Zaps, right? This what we now think of as the comic book look, right? These little dots and things. Right? We get Roy Lichtenstein taking comic book panels and blowing them up into larger-than-life pieces and calling them modern art, and not giving the original artists credit, by the way. But with the Batman showing up on TV, there's a resurgence, now a huge resurgence, in comics, right? Everybody starts to become much more interested in what's happening in the comic field. Right? Stan's still going. Everybody's still going, right? Everybody's going great until we get to the Bronze Age. Now, this is where we get a little bit complicated. It's where a lot of comic researchers vary and differ on when the Bronze Age starts, when the Silver Age ends. There's a couple of different things. Right, when does the Bronze Age start? Well, it could be any one of these. We're going to show you all of them, just real quick, maybe. Okay. September 1970, Jaq Kirby's last regular assignment for Marvel. There's not really enough time to go into all the horrid business practices. I mentioned Siegel and Schuster got paid $130 for Superman. They did get some money here and there, but while they got maybe tens of thousands, DC was making tens of millions. And so there's all sorts of things, and again, it's a whole different lecture on the business practices. For most comics, when you write it, it was a work for hire. Right? You didn't own those characters. So all of these characters were owned by the company. They owned the intellectual property. So when you're seeing these movies, when you're seeing, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, all those characters are owned by Marvel, not the individual creators. Right? The individual creators aren't getting the money for that. Jaq was getting tired of that. Jaq kept asking for more money. They kept saying no. So eventually, he left. Right? Fantastic Four number 102. Some people say that is the end of the Silver Age. That's the start of the Bronze Age. Kirby leaving Marvel and going over to DC. Well, could be. Could be this too. May, July 1971, Amazing Spider-Man. If you notice, there's no seal from the Comic Code Authority. It's because it involved drugs. There's 3 issues. It was about drug abuse. And the American government had come to Stan Lee and said, listen, we see that people like Marvel Comics. We see that young kids are looking up to superheroes. Can you do an anti-drug story? And Stan was like, yeah, sure, no problem. Except for the code. So he did the anti-drug story. They didn't submit the comic to the Comic Code Authority. They released it without the Comic Code Authority seal. You know what happened? Nothing. Nothing at all. They realized the Comic Code Authority didn't really have the teeth that they thought it had. Right? So that could be the end of the Silver Age. Now, we could take that one step further, go to this. Right? Here's Green Lantern and Green Arrow. He's another comeback. Right? His young ward, Speedy, again, that young sidekick. Speedy's a junkie. Speedy is shooting up heroin. But this one, sorry. No, there we go. Right? This one has the seal. Because the Comic Code Authority went, well, they're going to do it anyways. We might as well change the rules. So this could be the end of the Silver Age. For me, though, it's a little bit later, and I understand all the arguments for and against this, but for me, it's this. Right? June, July 1973, Amazing Spider-Man number 121, 122. Right? The cover here, right? Someone close to me is about to die, someone I cannot save. Turns out to be Gwen Stacy. Gwen Stacy is Spider-Man's girlfriend. She's a bit boring. Truth be told, she's a bit boring. And the creators, the writers at the time, went to Stan and said, hey, can we kill her off? Because he had another girlfriend. There's another girl that might have been interested, a girl by the name of Mary Jane Watson. And Mary Jane was a little bit more interesting of a character. Right? Gwen was just kind of this good girl. And yeah, she and Pete got along, but it's one of those like those remember your first love, right? The kind that if you realize now that it never would have worked out, and so you look back on it fondly. That was Gwen, and we get to this point. The Green Goblin, who is one of Spider-Man's biggest foes, sets up the situation where there's a tram on one side full of people and Gwen Stacy on the other. Different sides. They're both falling to their death. And Spider-Man has to figure out what to do. Well, Spider-Man's clever. He figures out a way to save both of them. Right? Very quickly, he throws his web down, grabs Gwen by the leg to save her. And then somebody in the art department through that. It has been determined the thing that killed Gwen Stacy was Peter Parker's webbing, grabbing her and yanking her to a stop. Snapped her neck, killed her instantly. Spider-Man kills his own girlfriend. Now, he didn't do it on purpose, but to me, that's the end of the Silver Age. Everything else is like, all right, that's interesting. But now we have a character who, that moment is going to haunt him pretty much until today. Now, being comic books, yeah, Gwen Stacy has come back a couple of times, but at the time, coming back wasn't a thing. Right? Now, once the comic book, how am I on time? Am I completely dead here? No, I'm okay, sort of. I'll go very quickly now for the rest of it. Once the comic book code, once the comic code authority was out, all of a sudden those horror comics, they came back. Right? We have things like The Tomb of Dracula, Werewolf by Night, The Living Vampire, because just having Dracula wasn't enough. Swamp Thing over at DC, not to be outdone. We have the Man-Thing over at Marvel. Ghost Rider, my personal favorite. And then we have Giant Size X-Men. Now, this is the X-Men coming back. The X-Men had died a ignominious death from the 60s. Basically, they put out about 50, 60 issues, and then they didn't want to cancel it, but they didn't really want to do anything new with it, so they were just reprinting titles. Then they decided, you know, what if we bring them back? Now, instead of that good old-fashioned, right, a lot of cis, hetero, white people, now it's an international group, right? You've got a Russian, you've got a German who looks like a demon, you've got an American Indian, he's from the old group, you've got an African and a Canadian. Right? And they're not necessarily nice people, right? Wolverine's great line, right? I'm the best at what I do, and what I do isn't very nice. Right? He's got claws, he kills people. We start to redefine what a hero is, and because we don't have the code as strict anymore, we still have the seal up there, but now we can have people like Kurt there, the Nightcrawler, who looks like a demon. We can have people of all races, sexes, and everything else coming into this, right? Then things get dark, right? The 70s go on, everything is nice and good, right? 1979, we get Iron Man, right? Tony Stark becoming an alcoholic. It's a bit dark, maybe, right? He has to, right? He turns on Jarvis, his butler. Right? He screws up. He basically has to give up the armor for a little while. He goes through all the steps of alcoholism. Really just isn't functioning as a person anymore. So that's a little bit dark, but really, I think the dark ages really start in 85, 86. Right? We start in 1985. Remember I told you that Flash was reading a Flash comic? That started the multiverse idea, right? That there are all these different universes that all have different variations. So, right, the Earth that we're on is one number. In Marvel, it's Earth 626. Right, the Earth in DC is Earth 1. Over the original Flash from the Golden Age, that's Earth 2. There's various others. And a guy named Marv Wolfman said, this is all really annoying and obnoxious, and how do you keep it all in your head? Screw it, let's kill everybody. Let's just combine all of the multiverses into one world. Yeah, some people died. A lot of things changed, but he did it. He took 12 issues and combined everything into one universe. Didn't last very long, the multiverse came back, but it was worth it, right? At the same time, we get The Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller, who postulates Batman. Right? One of his wards, one of the Robins, has died. Batman retires, can't take it anymore. The world realizes that there is no Batman, so therefore they can be criminals again. And so they take over, and he's just sitting in his mansion, you know, pouting. And then finally decides that he's going to go back out on the prowl and becomes the vigilante again. Meanwhile, Superman is now working for the U.S. government. right, fulfilling all the fascist agenda that has been ascribed to him over the years. And they have a big old fight at the end, answering that question once and for all. Who would win, Superman or Batman? The answer, of course, Batman. Right, Batman's the smartest guy in the room. As long as he's got enough time, he can beat anybody. There we go. Then you have The Watchmen, Alan Moore, which brings in, originally DC had bought a whole bunch of characters from a different company that was going under. They bought a whole bunch of characters. Alan Moore said, let me use them. Let me kill them. Killing superheroes, it's a great thing. They said, no, you can't do that. So that's okay. Moore said, fine. Created his own heroes, but what he did was he deconstructed the superhero genre completely. If you've seen the movie from about 10 years ago, wipe that from your memory and go back and read the book. Because what he did was he did things like, he has a hero who is a rapist, but he's a hero. How does that work? He's got heroes that can't have sex unless they're wearing their superhero costumes, because that's a pathology you want to get into. Right? Again, very, very dark. Starts to deal with what's actually happening in the mind of somebody that puts on an outfit and goes off to fight crime. And the last one I want to talk about in here is Frank Miller's Daredevil Born Again, where the bad guy, the Kingpin, instead of taking out Daredevil, the hero, takes out the alter ego, takes out the regular person, and destroys him, which means the hero can't really do anything. The hero has no place to operate from. Right? Again, all of these guys are deconstructing what it means to be a hero, and how does that fit into our modern world, right? The world of the 80s, right? World of Gordon Gekko, greed is good. How does that fit? From 1992, though, we get the modern age, right? Rise of the independents. We'll do this really quick. This is kind of where we end. And then in 1992, we get Image. We get people like Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, Eric Larson, Jim Valentino, Mark Silvestri, and Rob Liefeld. Liefeld, McFarlane, and Jim Lee at the time were the three hottest artists in comic books. Again, they didn't own their stuff. They were doing Spider-Man, they were doing the X-Men, they were doing all these books for Marvel, which were huge sellers. They didn't own them. They weren't getting royalties. So they said, screw it. Let's go form our own company. So they all left and formed their own company. Which gave us things, right? Todd McFarlane gave us Spawn. Rob Liefeld gave us Youngblood. Spawn is still going. Spawn, I think, just had 300 issues. Right? It's still going. But what we saw was that Marvel and DC were not the only game in town anymore. That there were other companies that could come in and hold their own market share. At one point, Image actually had the second market share next to it was Marvel, Image, and then DC. Right? Image was putting out 7 comics a month. DC was putting out 60, and Image was there. Right? So we started to see this idea of superhero being taken away from the corporate and being brought in personal. These guys were telling the stories they wanted to tell. So what's next? Well, who knows? Right? In the superhero world, we are getting a bunch of LGBT things, cute people. We're getting some revisionist stuff. The Iceman from the original X-Men has since come out as gay. We've had a gay wedding in Marvel. We've had divorces. We've had all sorts of real life problems and real life people, real life issues. We're getting a lot of transgender things now. And so the superheroes are looking at the world around them and adjusting and bringing it in the same way that Siegel and Schuster looked at the world that they saw, you know, or Simon and Kirby wanted a character to fight Hitler, right? Looked at the world they saw and brought it into the comics. The same thing is happening now. So, there you go. Any questions? Any questions? Yep.
Sorry, my English.
That's okay. Sorry, my Lithuanian.
What's your favorite comic?
My favorite is Ghost Rider.
Slowly.
Ghost Rider. I can show you if we go back a bit. One of those monster books. Oops. This guy. This is my favorite. But aside from that, I do like, I'm a Marvel guy. I like Spider-Man. I like Captain America. But so Marvel is my thing generally. Just yeah.
So comic books have always been, well, first of all, have comic books always been a serialized medium, like one issue a week or a month?
Yes.
And have there been any distinct long-form superhero comic books that you would recommend?
The Watchmen, certainly. We really started the multiple things. Fantastic Four did a 2-issue series. And then they actually did when the Avengers came out, Avengers number 4 ends with the Hulk fighting the Thing. And then Fantastic Four 25 and 26 pick that up, and then the fight actually ends in Avengers number 5. And so Stan kind of went, as long as they're all living in the same place, as long as they all know each other, we can have them do this. What's happened now, and this is where the idea of the graphic novel comes, is that writers and creators will write arcs. And so they'll have 7, 8, 10 issues of one story. And those get collected into what we now call graphic novels. Right, the Dark Phoenix saga of the X-Men is certainly a good one. I'm trying to think what else. Certainly the Watchmen. If you get out of the realm of superheroes, you get into like The Sandman by Neil Gaiman, which are great. It's the only comic book to ever win the Nebula Award for short story. So there's that. There's independents are doing a little bit more with that idea. With comics, what you end up with is miniseries. Like the Hawkeye had a miniseries, a 4-issue miniseries. Wolverine had a 4-issue miniseries. And you start to get these creators that say, okay, I've got an idea for these characters that'll only last, 4, 6, 8 issues or whatever. And so they'll renumber one it and put it out. So it's whatever the character, right? What am I reading now? Jessica Jones' Blind Spot. Right? It's a 5-issue series. And so they give it a title, and they have 5 issues or whatever many issues to tell that particular story, and then it's done. Within the comics, within the regular continuity, you get things like those 3 issues. We saw the Silver Surfer there. That was the last of 3 issues with the tale of Galactus, who is this huge being that comes in and he eats the energy of planets, and the Fantastic Four have to defeat him. But that was a 3-issue thing, considered probably the pinnacle of the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby Fantastic Four run. So you've got things like that. If that's, but as far as what I would recommend right off the bat would be Watchmen. The Authority is kind of interesting. Over DC. But if you want straight one-shot stories, I would look for the miniseries compilations. Right? And there are a number of those. Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. At the very beginning, you said that superheroes were largely an American construct. So my question has something to do with that. Why would you think superheroes in comics as a publishing topic never kind of took off in Europe? Well, if you look at Japan, for instance, when they developed manga, you got all that stuff like Dragon Ball Z or One Piece with like superhero type of characters, which are strictly speaking not superhero mangas, but it never happened in Europe for some reason.
I don't know. I think it's starting to happen now. People like Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, Grant Morrison. There's a number of British writers that came over to America that were writing superhero stuff in the undergrounds, like Warrior magazine, which is where V for Vendetta and Miracle Man started. so it started coming like in the 70s and 80s, once it had been established in America. And the thing is that comic books themselves, and the form of the graphic narrative, absolutely existed here. I mean, if you ever go to Brussels, there's a great comic book museum, just not superheroes. I mean, there are a number of books, psychological books, about what the ethos pathos is of superheroes and what makes them, right? The idea of the individual, the American exceptionalism, the idea that might makes right. Like I said, Superman is often accused of being a fascist because it's just the idea that I'm stronger than you, I can do what I want. There was a thing in 1940 I'm not going to remember which magazine it was, but they interviewed Siegel and Schuster and they said, why doesn't Superman stop the war? And he drew a little, 2-page thing, right? Schuster, they drew a little 2-page thing of, if Superman actually existed, right, you basically fly over, grabs Hitler, grabs Mussolini, takes him to The Hague, and here you go, war crimes, and it's done. But that's, that's that might makes right, and so he can do it because he's Superman. And that is absolutely, I think, an American idea, right? The traditional cowboy approach of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, we can do it by ourselves. That's American exceptionalism, and I think that's where it starts with the comic book superheroes. Like I said, I think once we get into the 80s, once we get into people like Moore and Miller and Morrison, looking at it, I think that does change. And I think we do become a little bit more international. As far as manga goes, the difference there, it has to do with storytelling. The Eastern storytelling and Western storytelling are very, very different in terms of story structures and pacing and things like that. So that could also be it, but they certainly take a lot of the conventions from the American superheroes. Absolutely.
Sorry, I have another question from the internet this time. You mentioned the Watchmen movie.
Yes.
What do you think about the Watchmen TV series?
Great. No question. Okay. Here's my take. The Watchmen TV series I thought was fantastic because what it did was it took the ideas, because what Moore was dealing with in the 80s was kind of a Cold War mentality, and absolutely you can see that throughout the 12 issues of the book. But what the TV series did was it took the ideas and the concepts and the themes of the original miniseries and translated it to a more modern day. It became more about racism. It became more about again, right, the idea of the superhero. What does it mean to be a superhero? And so rather than the kind of slavish fidelity that the movie had to the comic, it just kept the intent, translated it 30 years into the future, and I think had a great run. And I love the fact that at this point, Damon Lindelof, who created it, said that was it. That was the story I wanted to tell. We're done. And there is no season 2. There's no plans for a season 2. And I'm like, thank God. I think they did exactly what they needed to do. So I loved it. Anything else?
I have a question.
No.
So you mentioned various cultural trends that comic books were related to, like drugs or World War II, or
Sure.
what's happening in modern day with more LGBT characters and so on. So do you think comics more represent what's going on in culture, or are there comics that like blaze the trail and go ahead, like what people usually tell about Star Trek, how it was very forward-thinking in its depiction of women roles, of black people and so on. So do comics do that?
I think they can. I don't think that they happen in the mainstream comics as much. I think the mainstream comics are still following behind. But certainly in the independent creators and the smaller companies, yeah, absolutely. And I think yeah, the superheroes still exist, no question, and the superheroes are still there and they're still making money. But I think that a lot of new creators are understanding the graphic form, and you get things like Lumberjanes or Paper Girls, Fence, where they're not superhero stories; they're just stories. Sometimes they might have a kind of a supernatural element or something, but they're just stories, and they're about everybody and anybody, right? Lumberjanes is about girls at at a sleepaway camp. Some of whom are gay, some of whom are transgender, some of whom are cis, and and they're just all friends, and they all go on adventures, and yeah, there's some kind of supernatural stuff, but it's it's about the relationships, and so I think that in those places, in those smaller studios, and the independent creators, I think absolutely, you're breaking all sorts of ground. Just the fact that they're doing graphic narratives, not writing books, I think is phenomenal. But again, they're getting away from the superheroes. Or if they are dealing with superheroes, they're dealing with them in very unusual and unique ways. And again, and playing with those conventions. So, yeah.
Anyone else?
Yep.
In your lecture, you have touched upon the topic of some real-life trends, events dictating some trends in superhero comic, like Second World War, war on drugs, and so on and so forth. So, what do you think is the cause behind the current craze in superhero cinema? Now, half of the big Hollywood releases that get billions of dollars are superhero related.
Yeah.
Why they are so popular?
Because they're good. They're good stories. At least with it's funny because I don't think the DC universe is very good, but I think the Marvel universe is. And part of that I think is because they use superheroes to tell stories. They don't tell stories about superheroes. If that makes sense, right? If you look at Ant-Man, yeah, he's a superhero, but it's a heist movie. If you look at Captain America, the First Avenger, it's 3 Days of the Condor with superheroes. If you know 3 Days of the Condor. If you don't, go watch 3 Days of the Condor. It's a great Robert Redford, Cold War spy movie. Right, but it's a spy movie. It's an intrigue movie that just happens to have superheroes, and they treat them as actual characters. I think a lot of it also. I think there's a certain nostalgia. I think there's a certain name recognition. And I think that they're really well done stories that don't patronize. I think, if you look at the DC ones, with the exception of Wonder Woman, I think they patronize. I think they're going, hey, we're superhero stories, let me tell you a superhero story. And I think the Marvel stories are, let me tell you a good story that we have superheroes for. We have superheroes in. That's my take, but I don't know. One more?
Somebody online asked just Doc Savage ? I think you mentioned Doc Savage in the beginning.
Doctor Strange. Doc Savage, absolutely, right? There's all sorts of anecdotal evidence. There's all sorts of anecdotal evidence that says that a lot of Superman comes from Doc Savage. The Fortress of Solitude, kind of having the superhero guy. But Doc Savage was a pulp hero. He's a great pulp hero, but he's a pulp hero. He never kind of went over, he was an adventurer, never actually went over into the realm of superheroes per se, beyond just being a extreme example of a person. But no, I love Doc Savage. So. One more?
Yes. I promise this is my last question, but there's this concept of it looks like there's a finite set of superhero characters. Is this unique to superheroes? Because it looks like there's a large number of artists that all write Batman stories, Green Arrow stories, X-Men stories, and so on and so on and so on. And
No, not at all. Those are certainly the main heroes. They're certainly the main heroes of the big two companies, right? And yeah, you know, it becomes a money grab. I mean, in the 80s, every other comic was an X something comic. You know, X-Men was huge, and so they spun off as many different X titles as they could, and they bring in artists and writers to draw them. And then there are people that go, hey, I've got a great idea for a Batman story. Let me write a Batman story. You know, Batman's a great character, but absolutely not. I mean, every creator has their own thing, and there's new superheroes coming out all the time. Again, mostly from the independents. A lot of it because you don't necessarily want to create a character. I mean, it's changed now, but in the 80s into the 90s, you didn't want to create a character for Marvel or DC because they owned it. And so that's why these guys went off and formed Image, was because they had ideas for new characters that they wanted to play with, and they weren't going to give them, you know, just hand them over to Marvel. It's because what ends up happening, do you know what fan fiction is?
Yes.
Right? So yeah, that's okay. Right? Because that's what we end up with, right? Is you know, Lee and Kirby and Ditko created that whole run of great characters, and everybody else has just been playing fan fiction. It's authorized fan fiction, but that's all it is. Is they're taking these characters that they didn't create and putting their own spin on it and writing their own stories with them. And so, as you know, if you were to track the progression of any particular character, I mean, Superman is a prime example. You can track Superman from 1938 to today and look at the differences between how all the different writers and creators approached him, and you know how much power they gave him or how much power they took away. And so even though he's the same character, the different creators, different writers brought different things to it, and then they would go on and create their own characters in whatever form they wanted. So I don't think that there's a limit to it. I think within the main companies, you've got your certain big name heroes, but even beyond, even the smaller heroes. I mean, Marvel at one point has like 4,000 characters. You know, and if you look at the Marvel universe, Iron Man isn't that big. Wasn't. Now he is, right? Ant-Man, not really that big. Now he is. Right? It's these people that Guardians of the Galaxy. Come on. And yet, you know, somebody went, yeah, here's this group of characters that nobody's heard of in 20 years. Let's make a movie. And now they're huge. So I don't think, and I think, you know, it's just limited by the creator's imagination. I don't think that there's a finite limit to the amount of superheroes that there can be. So, thank you, guys.
I think we should really let you go so that you can catch a train, but not before giving you a commemorative mug. So, thank you very much for the talk.
Thank you all.
Yes, thank you all for coming and for watching the stream.